Who comes to a conference in 2024 and talks about Perl? Me, apparently. My name is Jason Crome. Some of you can find me online as Chrome Dome. And if you liked me before this talk, you're probably not going to like me after. But anyway, I'm here to talk to you today about modern web development in Perl, which may sound like an oxymoron to you, but believe me, it is actually a thing. How many of you have used Perl? Within the last 10 years? Currently using Perl? Okay, that's what I expected. All right. You may not know Perl, you may not like Perl, but we're going to try and have some fun today anyway. And so what we're going to cover is a brief history of Perl, some of its strengths, some of its weaknesses. Towards the end, we're going to build a small web application and API using Dancer 2. And then we're going to see a demonstration of that application. So who am I to take over the next hour of your life? Well, as you can tell, I'm a geek, like many of you are. I'm a private pilot. I'm a hockey player who likes long walks on the beach. Does any of this make me qualified to talk to you about Perl today? No, it does not. But we're not going to let that stop us. I've been in this industry a really long time, and I've been fortunate that Perl has been the second act of my career, and it's been really, really good to me. I first used it in 2004, but I didn't start using it full time until about 2015. And I've been all over the industry with Perl, working on all sorts of big and scary applications. I served for 2 years as the Grants Committee Secretary for the Perl and Raku Foundation, helping funds from the Perl Foundation to get to people that are working on developing and improving the language in the community. Organizer of Charlotte Perl Mongers. A little bit of hiatus right now because I just moved, but we'll be back. As Barry mentioned, I'm one of the Dancer core developers, which is the framework that I'm going to show you later. It's a modern web framework for Perl. And I really like dead or dying technologies. BSDs, Powerbuilder, Perl, you name it. If it's dead or dying, I'm a fan of it. So what is Perl? I'm going to tell you a little bit about the language through a series of pictures, and we'll see who associates the most with different pictures here. Most of you probably know the camel. Anybody who's seen any of the O'Reilly books on Perl are probably very familiar with the camel. It's the mascot of the Perl language. I don't know who to attribute this quote to, but it goes, "Perl is a lot like a camel. It may look ugly in the end, but it does the job, and it does the job well." Whoever spoke this quote left out a very important part, and like a camel, it occasionally spits at you. And then there's the onion, which is the logo of the Perl and Raku Foundation. Perl is like an onion in that it's tasty, but it will sometimes make you cry. And then there's the Swiss Army chainsaw. It is very powerful, very versatile, but it can be clunky and noisy. Perl has sometimes been known as the Velociraptor. I'll let you draw your own conclusions about this one. All that to say, contrary to popular belief, Perl is user-friendly. A lot like Unix, it's very particular on who it makes friends with. This is Larry Wall. He's the inventor of the Perl language. I'm going to share with you this quote that I really like about the language. Most of you are familiar with the virtues of a programmer. There are three, of course: laziness, impatience, and hubris. And Perl is the embodiment of all of these. All kidding aside, we'll dive into the history of Perl now, because it's important to know where you've been to understand where it is that you're going. Perl is a dynamic language that was first created in 1987 by Larry. It can be statically typed. We're not going to go into that today, but it was developed as a dynamic language. And Larry is actually a linguist turned computer programmer. And you can see a lot of the influence that different spoken and written languages have had as you use the Perl language. He was first known for a little utility that probably nobody is familiar with called patch. That was one of his earliest creations. Is anybody here still familiar with Usenet? A couple of you out there. Larry wrote a little program called RN, which is one of the original Usenet readers, making him a pioneer in the social media space. But he was working on reporting, and he wrote Perl because he kept running into stumbling blocks with sed and awk and bash. And he developed Perl to address all of these. Version 1 came out in 1987, other releases over the years, but all of this takes us to the release of Perl 5 in 1994. And shortly after that is when our industry goes bonkers. There's the dot-com boom, there's the dot-com crash, and everything before and after that. What's really important to know is none of that happens without Perl. And why do I say that? Because before that, people were writing web applications in C. Can you imagine writing a modern web application in C? This isn't a world I want to live in. And apparently nobody else at the time did either. So here's a few reasons why you should use Perl. It's a very expressive language. You can do a lot with a single line of code. Ironically, it's kind of terse too. But it's still pretty readable. And I know a lot of you are probably thinking that, no, Perl is not readable. It's got a reputation as being an unreadable language. You can write unreadable code in any language. That's really not something that is specific to Perl. There is a lot of unreadable Perl out there. We'll address some of that in a little bit, but a lot of the unreadable code people point to is what's known as golfing challenges, where people will have a goal in Perl and then keep rewriting it to see how few characters they can write to actually accomplish that goal. Those aren't real programs. Like Barry was actually saying, it is fast. It is ridiculously fast for an interpreted language. It's never going to match up with the speed of like a C, a C++, or Go or Rust. But for a dynamic language, you really can't do any better as far as speed goes. Perhaps the most powerful and important feature of Perl is its regular expression engine. Perl compatible regular expressions are not Perl regular expressions. They are so powerful and so fast to work with. They can be hard to read, yes, but it's what gave Perl an early advantage over other dynamic languages in this space. This may strike a lot of you as odd, but it's actually a first-class object-oriented programming language. In fact, I can think of 5 different object systems in Perl off the top of my head. 2 of them are actually baked into the core of the language, but the language is such that through modules and extensions, you can actually add third-party object systems into the language. And the most popular ones today actually have been added that way. Frameworks called Moose and Moo are extremely popular. And in fact, Dancer, which I'm going to show you later, is built on the Moo object framework. Excellent testing culture. I don't know how or when this started because it predates my involvement in the community, but for the entire time I have been involved in the community, there has been this devotion to automated testing, unit testing, and just testing all of the code that you're going to use and publish. The Perl 5 language does it, and almost any module in the public domain does it. In fact, there's a whole network of testers called CPAN testers. And a bunch of volunteers run different smoke testers, and every module that gets uploaded to CPAN, which we'll talk about later, gets tested on every supported OS and version of Perl. And they're actually very proactive about contacting module authors if your module fails tests. I've been contacted a number of times because it was late at night, I forgot to run the tests, shipped the module, and the testers caught it. It's a really great volunteer service, but it really shows our dedication to quality in the Perl community. Robust and mature toolchain. This is actually something that keeps me away from some other languages. We've got a really great set of tools in our ecosystem for building modules, for testing, for packaging, for deploying. They're real mature, they're very stable, they're very easy to use. These are solved problems in our world. And I go to other languages, which I'm not going to name by name, but I often get frustrated when I have to use the tooling there. And a lot of times it's what turns me away from investing any further time in that language or ecosystem. And then there's CPAN, the Comprehensive Perl Archive Network. It may not have been the first collection of open source code out there, but if not the first, it was definitely one of the first. It debuted in 1999, I think. It's an online repository of different modules, frameworks, and other extensions to the Perl language. Anything that you would want to look for, somebody who's probably mostly solved that problem at this point. And you can just point your browser at CPAN, look to see what's out there, read the reviews, look at the code, look at the tests, decide if you want to use it in your own applications. Finally, there's Tim Toady. Somebody tell me what that is? Yes. I will name names in this one. There's a lot of frameworks out there. I'll use Ruby on Rails as an example that is very opinionated. There's the Rails way or there's no way. Perl is the exact opposite of that. Larry and the other language designers realized that everybody works differently. Everybody has a different way of building applications, of building code. And they wanted to design a language that allowed you to do that. And so everything about Perl is giving you multiple ways to do it. Some people view that as a con. I view it as a plus because you're not locked into any particular one way of doing things. The way that the authors intended you to do something is not often the best way to do it. So what's it good at? Don't need to dive much into data munging or text processing. It's what it's originally famous for. It does an amazing job at that, probably better than most languages. DevOps, system utilities, glue. I'm not talking about Elmer's glue, but it's really good for writing your own homegrown utilities to manage things. It's really good for taking other people's utilities, dealing with the output of those, shoving them as input into other applications, and then dealing with the output of those as well. It's a really nice way to take a bunch of tools that you kind of like, but not exactly, and to make something that you actually do like out of them. Online games may seem a little bit weird, but there's at least 2 massively multiplayer online games that have been developed in Perl. I know one of them I've actually worked on, so speaking from experience. It's good for database applications. It's actually good for GUI applications, which seems really bizarre. It's a scripting language. But I work with somebody who, for years, made a career out of developing GUI applications in Perl. It's actually very interesting and at least pretty cool to me. Anything requiring stability, Perl's a good choice for. I'll talk about that in just a moment. And then there's this quality about Perl that my friend Ruth calls whip-upitude. And you've got an idea in your head, you want to quickly prototype it, or you want to quickly get it done so you can move on to something that's a little more interesting to you. Perl gives you the ability to do that because it's got a high amount of whip-upitude. And this is just to name a few. There's some things that Perl isn't good at, and some of these go without saying for dynamic languages. You're not going to want to build a device driver, a 3D game engine. Perl's not really good at threaded applications. This last bullet point, anytime you don't have time to handle the learning curve, you might be interested in Perl. You might want to do an application in Perl, but you don't really know Perl and you're kind of under the gun to get something done. It's probably not the best choice in those situations just because it is a different way of working, and if you're under a time crunch, the learning curve just might be too much to bite off. There's a lot of misconceptions out there about the Perl language, and you've probably heard a lot of them. Perl's dead, Perl's dying. It's just for sysadmins, it's just for crufty old graybeards, it's not for real development. It's not modern and hasn't been updated in years. Why do these exist? Part of it is we suck at marketing. And by we, to a smaller extent, I mean the software community. A larger extent, I specifically mean the Perl community. In the early days, the language marketed itself. At some point, it didn't market itself anymore, and we're like, oh crap, we should do something here. And we're not very good at marketing the language, unfortunately. We're working on improving that, but. And then there's this little thing called Mat Script Archive. I don't know if any of you who've been around for a while are familiar with it. In the early days of Perl, this guy, Matt, thought it'd be great to make all of these things that you could just add to your website that you might not otherwise have, forums and emailable forms and whatnot. There's a couple of problems with it. They were immensely popular, which was great for the Perl language. But it was immensely popular, and that was bad because they were really poorly written and riddled full of security holes. And so a lot of bad Perl exists because of that. People use it as a model for their own applications. And so a lot of bad code came to be out there, and I think Perl kind of unfairly developed a bad reputation because of that. Came from a good place, but is what it is. I'd like to stress that Perl is actively developed. Perl 5.40 was released in June of this year. It's the 24th major release of Perl 5. And the team that's building Perl is averaging one major production release every year. Does that seem like a dead language to you? It's not to me. In fact, Perl is so not dead that Charlie Strauss, the author of the laundry files, felt obligated to chime in on Mastodon last week to tell the world just how not dead Perl was. It's almost like somebody told him that I was giving this talk and that I could use a little cheerleader. Thanks, Charlie. Stability. Probably Perl's most important feature, at least in my opinion. Nobody talks much about stability in programming languages because stability is boring. Unless you're an enterprise that can't handle your apps breaking when you've updated your operating system or some packages. Has that happened to anybody? A couple of you. This doesn't happen in the Perl ecosystem. There's a relentless devotion to backwards compatibility. And because of that, there's a lot of code that was written a long, long time ago, even back to the 90s, that still runs unmodified on current versions of Perl. Even though the Perl of 2024 doesn't exactly resemble the Perl of 1995. And I know this because I'm currently working on one of those applications. I work on something called Request Tracker, an open source enterprise ticketing system. It was first written in 1996, and it can still run on Perl's at least 15 years old that I can think of. Other applications that I worked on prior to this actually do run unmodified, all the way back on. They were written in the early 90s. How are some of the ways they do this? Feature guards. The very first one you see up there is the use version pragma. Use version 540 says in this Perl program, I want to require version 540 and all the features that come with it, as opposed to the default, which I believe is like Perl 5.6, which is from around 2000 or so. And then you can incrementally add features without dragging all of the modern features in. You can use subroutine signatures without using anything new that's appeared in 520 or 526 or whatnot. And you can even use experimental features that may one day become part of the core of the language with the use experimental pragma. What these do is it allows developers and module authors and consumers of those to require the versions of Perl that have the bug fixes and the features that they need. New features shouldn't break backwards compatibility, and the people that are developing the core of the language pay very close attention to that. And that's why we have these feature guards, to ensure that things don't break. This is just a short list of companies that I could think of off of the top of my head that are still using Perl because stability is boring and they have a business to run. I really want to draw attention to the last two on the list, Google and Amazon here. Without Perl, the whole trajectory of the internet and our industry changes. I have it from a trusted source that search results from Google were delivered by a Perl script much, much longer than anybody would think that they were. Okay, let's go ahead and build a web app. Please keep in mind that the purpose of this is fun, not correctness. I'm going to do some things that I would never do in a production application. Don't judge me for this, but too much reality makes for a really crappy show and tell. Before we dive into the code, I want to tell you about Dancer 2. Obviously, Dancer 2 would be the successor to Dancer 1. Happens to be my favorite web framework. I might be a little bit biased as I'm a developer and maintainer of it, but it's a lightweight MVC framework that was developed at a time that Perl was lacking one. There was a very popular web framework at the time called Catalyst. It's big, it's heavy, it's a 900-pound gorilla, and it's overkill for probably 85% of web applications. And this was an underserved space. And our project founder also happened to be a Ruby developer in addition to a Perl developer, and he had found Sinatra at that time. And so Dancer 2, well, the original Dancer, is really a love letter to Sinatra, actually. It's a fairly compatible, I guess, tribute to what Sinatra is in Ruby. As far as other languages go, you could probably compare Dancer to Flask in Python, to Dart Frog that Ryan was talking about yesterday. It's an a la carte web framework. Some frameworks like Rails and Django give you everything. They consider it batteries included. Dancer 2 goes more the Perl route, and there's more than one way to do it. So you just bring your own stuff with you. The way that Dancer makes web development easy is it implements a DSL, a domain-specific language, for describing and designing and implementing your web application. And you can also build APIs with it. The great thing about Dancer is you don't have to be a Perl expert to make a good application with Dancer. It helps, I'm not going to lie, but you can not have a lot of Perl knowledge and still build a working application. It runs anywhere that Perl does. There's a lot of different deployment options. When you generate an application, it will even generate a Docker file for you, so you can containerize your application immediately. My favorite feature about Dancer is its community. It's very warm and friendly and diverse and inclusive. It was the Perl code and the framework that got my foot in the door, but it's the community that has made me stay all of these years. It's awesome. So finally, some code. We're going to generate a sample application, and that's done with the Dancer 2 command. It takes a couple of options. Gen says generate an app. The -a parameter says what's the name of that app. We're going to call it Gorge. And we're going to ask it to generate a Docker file. And then we're going to change to that directory, and we're going to execute that application. So what is PlackUp? It's an instance script for firing up what's known as a Plack server in the Perl world. Plack is an interface between your Perl code and your web server. It's a lot like Rack in the Ruby world. In fact, that's a lot of what it was modeled on. It speaks a protocol called PSGI, which is not surprisingly compatible with WSGI. So it runs on a lot of the same servers that your Python apps do as well. And then, so let's run that command and see what the output looks like. Ah, there we go. Spits out a bunch of files, but more interestingly, at the end of it, it tells you how to build your Docker container and run that. If you don't want to run it with Docker, which we're not going to do, it tells you how to run it that way too. It tells you where to go to access your new application. And because we try to be helpful, it gives you a bunch of links to resources to where to go if you need help building your application. Yeah, helps if you change to the directory, helps if you pay attention to the directions. It spits out a little bit of information and it tells you that, hey, it's now running. And that's what your base Dancer application looks like. It's really just a welcome page, tells you a little bit about the environment you're running, how to get going with it, and gives you some helpful resources. Not very interesting all on its own. So let's make this interesting. Oh, before I leave this page, in development mode, it's going to dump all of your logs to the console, which isn't what you're going to want to do in production, but for development, it's really handy not to have to go anywhere to see how your application is broken. So this is the application code that's produced when you run that command. And it's very, very simple. Package gorge, that's the name of your application. And then to add the Dancer functionality to it, you just use Dancer 2. And that's it. All the functionality that comes with the base framework is now a part of your application. That includes all the keywords, templating, sessions, anything that comes as part of the language. And then here's where things get a little interesting. The first line after use Dancer 2 is what's called a route declaration. And this is an endpoint or a URL that your application is going to respond to. And you preface this with the HTTP verb that you want it to respond to: get, post, delete, put, all the others. And then you give it the endpoint. And then you give it a route handler, which is a subroutine that takes action when that endpoint is hit. And this one is really, really simple. We introduce the template keyword that says, I want you to render this template. The template's name happens to be index. And then you'll see this really funny syntax over there. Title is a variable on that template, and gorge is the value that we want to fill in. And that's it. That's a running application. Let's make it a little more interesting. Let's add some database support to this. And so there's two parts to this. The first part of it is just setting what the configuration is. And you'll see out of the box, the configuration is just a YAML file. It supports JSON, Apache config, anything that you're comfortable with, because again, there's more than one way to do it. But YAML demonstrates well, so we went with that. So we specify our list of plugins. We're going to use one called database. The actual name of it is called Dancer 2 plugin database, but you don't want to have to type it all the time, so we don't make you do that. You can see that it's using an SQLite database. We tell it what the path and file name to it is, and then we pass a couple of configuration parameters to the database interface. I want to talk about config for a second. Because I'm lazy and because it's easier to demo, I threw all of this into the main config file for the application. Dancer supports something called environments, and you can set configuration for different environments your app will run in: development, QA, production. And it intelligently merges the configuration based upon what environment you tell the app is running in. So you may have an entirely different set of configuration for your production apps than your development apps. And so when you tell Dancer to run in the production environment, it'll look at your base config and look at your production config and merge them intelligently. Now the second part of this is actually then to activate that database plugin. And we use that with another pragma, use Dancer2 plugin database. And you'll see our index route has now gotten a bit more interesting. We've introduced a new database keyword, which returns a database handle so that you can interact with the database. And we're telling it to prepare the SQL statement, which I abbreviated so that the text on the slide didn't turn out to be too small. It won't actually run. And then we execute that. And then we have this method called fetchRow hashref. And what that's going to do is it's going to take the one row that database query matches and throws it into a hash reference, which is a data type in Perl. So you've got this one variable with an ID in question and any other column that is in this database row you can easily access. And we follow that up. OK, fine. We're going to show you a question, and we're going to show you a list of possible answers to go with it. And so we take the hashref that we just used, and we do a quick select on the answers table. And we got some funny notation over there, but we're using the question ID out of that question hashref that we just retrieved. And we use it to get the list of answers that we want. And then, just like when I showed you template a slide or two ago, it's the same thing. We still want to render a template, the index template, and we're passing it two different parameters this time. One called gotcha, which has all the data for the question row that we fetched. And then we have another one called answers, which has the list of all the potentially matching answers for this question. In a real application, I would probably do a lot of this down in the model layer, and you wouldn't see much of this in the actual controller. But again, not the most interesting for a brief demonstration. This is just a little snippet of YAML showing how you integrate one of the templating systems with your application. I like Template Toolkit. Like most languages, templating systems are a dime a dozen. Find the one that you want and just plug it into your Dancer application. And then here's what the template actually looks like. It's just a snippet of HTML with some special tags thrown in. You'll see on the second line, there's gotcha.question. If you remember, we passed a parameter named gotcha, and question is the actual text of the question. And so we're gonna fill that spot in with the question we want to show the user. And then in the select, we've just got a little loop that builds out all the options. We passed it a list of questions, and so it iterates through those and uses the database ID is the value of the option, and then we show the text as the display. Some of you probably see where this is going yet, and if you have, don't ruin it for your neighbors. And what do we do with that snippet once it's generated? Dancer sticks it in something called a layout automatically. And a layout is just another HTML template. This one has a special variable called content, which takes the output of whatever you generated with the template keyword and sticks it right here. And then this too is a template, so you can use other template variables in here. Settings is a special variable that Dancer adds automatically, which gives you access to your application's configuration in the templating system. And now we need to do something with this form. Sorry if this is hard to read in the back. I've tried to shrink it down as much as possible. You'll see in the form, it posts to an endpoint named Quest. And this route actually is the implementation of Quest. You'll see that it starts with post instead of get, like our other route. And it uses this new keyword called body parameters to get the name that was submitted. Dancer provides nice keywords for body parameters, which are submitted through your forms, through your route parameters, which show up in your URL, and query parameters, which show up in the query string after the question mark in the URL. We take that and we stick it in a session. There's a number of different session engines available. There's database, there's files, you can use Redis, whatever you're comfortable with. I use YAML for development because it just creates a YAML file on your disk. And if you need to see the data that's in the session, instead of writing yourself a little utility to get it, you can just cat the file. It's super easy. So in this next line, I want to get some information about the answer that the user picked. Can anybody see the very stupid thing that I did in this line? So I fetched from the database without doing any sort of sanitation of what the user entered. Would never do that in production, but I just fetched the parameter that they did and I stuck it in the database query. And then I stick that information in the session. And then this answers table kind of functions like a rules engine, and you'll see why in just a second. But then we make some decisions based upon what it was that the user picked. Is the answer correct? OK, let's stick their name in a database table to show other people that they successfully did this. And then let's take some other action based upon that. If this casts keeper column is set, then we want to show the user this one template. And if it's not, we're going to send them some other place. And that forward keyword is kind of what Dancer considers to be an internal redirect. So your external redirect is going to change the URL in your browser bar. The internal redirect just changes the flow of your program in Dancer. So you can decide on the fly, oh, we shouldn't really be doing this action right now. We should be doing this other action over here. Forward gives you the ability to do that. The reason why we have the method get at the end is forward by default uses the verb that your route was accessed with. I don't want to do a post here. I wanted to do a get. And so that's what we did. Everybody ready to see this in action?
Yeah, do it.
All right. Let me. All right. I've got the actual finished version of the code in a different directory. So we'll run this. And we'll refresh. And lo and behold, we're at the bridge of death, the gorge of eternal peril. Sorry, I'm having a very hard time seeing over here. So, what is your name? Arthur, what is your quest to seek the Grail? What is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? What kind? African or European? I don't know that. But it wouldn't be a good demo if I didn't show the other options too. So let's play this again. What's your name? Robin. What's your quest to seek the Grail? What's the capital of Assyria? I don't know that. Ah. OK, we have a few more options, so let's play this again. What's your name? Lancelot. What's your quest to seek the Grail? What's your favorite color? Blue. Yep, right, off you go. We have one other fun surprise in there. What's the capital of Assyria? Oh, wait, no, it's, A couple of other little pieces of functionality here. You can see who else has crossed the bridge. That insert that I did after the form was posted was just a little bit of sugar to keep track of anybody who was sent on their merry way or beat the bridge keeper. And then one other thing to show. See my answers at JSON. Oops, found a bug. Whoops. Let's try that again. OK. And so it takes our answers, reads them from the session, and generates it as a little bit of JSON, and then delivers that to the customer. How does it do that? Let's go back to our slides. And so there was one other route I didn't show you until now. And this actually generates that JSON response. Again, it's a GET request. We declare this array called myResponse. We loop through our session parameters, name, quest, and answer. And then we add a hash reference to that array for each one of the parameters in the session. Perl makes it real easy to just iterate through them, fetch the data from the session, add it to the array. And then Dancer gives you this keyword sendAs for changing what the output is going to be. Defaults to HTML, but with sendAs, we're now going to send JSON instead of the HTML that we were rendering with template before. Out of the box, we support JSON, YAML, XML. SendAs is really nice if you're working with a front-end application and you need to send little snippets of JSON to your front-end application. If you actually want to build an API, we have some app-wide serializers that you can use. You can set your serializer to JSON or YAML or XML. And then all of your responses, you just return a scalar or an array or a hash, and Dancer is automatically going to convert that to the desired data format for you. You don't even have to think about it at that point. We even have it in, if you have a case where you don't know the type of data that you're going to need to return to your client, we actually have what we call the mutable serializer as well. And so it determines based on the request, they asking for JSON or XML, and the application is going to respond appropriately. That was a whirlwind, I know. You guys all did great. Thanks for sticking with me through all that. A couple of closing thoughts for you. If you take only one thing away from this talk today, let it be this. But in all seriousness, Perl's a lot of fun. It's fast to build things with. It makes my life easy, and it makes the life of a lot of other developers that I know easy. You can do a lot with a little bit of code, which, as you can see, we recreated the Bridge of Death and the Gorge of Eternal Peril with maybe 24 lines of code. But you have to want to learn it. Do we have our problems? Yeah, what language and community doesn't? But Perl is really good at making easy things easy and hard things possible. It's a great language. It's got a great future, though we don't get a lot of press that shows that. And if you haven't tried it, I really encourage you to try it. Thank you for getting up and spending your morning with me. I have my contact information on the left if you want to reach out to me. The QR code up here is going to take you to the GitHub repository that actually has all of the parts of the demo today that I didn't show on slides. So you can go there, and there's actually a copy of the slides in the repository, so you can grab it there. I'll dump this information to Zulip after I leave the stage today. Thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate you all.